What's up, everybody? My name is Ryan Smith. I am the CEO of Recharge and Hoko CrossFit, as well as I'm faculty for the clinical management of the Fitness Athlete online course and live course through the Institute of Clinical Excellence. And today is Fitness Athlete Friday, so I'm here to talk to you about top exercises for those fitness athletes you're working with who have hip impingement. Right? It's kind of what we're working through today. So I want to discuss a little bit of context up front before we get into the exercises in a multitude of ways. So I purposely put impingement in quotes because, for one, we are redefining kind of what FAI is and how we're diagnosing it. The Warwick Agreement is a great, I think, article and paper to kind of work through the new diagnostics we're going through. And long story short, it goes into it's both a physical exam and assessment combined with radiological findings that determine if somebody truly has some sort of FAI or femoral acetabular impingement, right? So I think that's a great way to look into the actual pathophysiology of it and the pathology of hip impingement, but also it's in quotes because more often than not, when we have fitness athletes coming in, they report, hey, Ryan, when I squat or deadlift or do this or that, I feel pinchiness in my hip, like it's deep in the joint. It's kind of coming across here, and it just doesn't feel quite right. That can be on a spectrum of very, very debilitating pain to this is really annoying every time I work out. So where you're going to see this a lot in, and I think what the work agreement looks over in great detail, is that those fitness athletes that come to you that had a high previous history of athletic performance or played, soccer, basketball, stuff for years. And now we're kind of transferring into a more fitness athlete, weekend warrior type of position, right? And now the demands on their body, squatting to full depth in terms of those CrossFit athletes you have, or if they're doing some sort of Tough Mudder or stuff like that, and they're getting their hip into positions that they really haven't nurtured over a long period of time in comparison to what they used to do, or if they have little cross-train experience, those are the individuals that we need to be a little bit more on high alert of, hey, you used to go really hard in the paint, you have a lot of capacity. How do you feel when you're doing these specific motions that are requiring a lot more mobility and range of motion out of your hip as far as we go through there? So for context, the Warwick Agreement and those type of individuals are ones we kind of want to have this being geared towards. Second, for context, we want to determine irritability of these individuals. Now, I have personal experience, anecdotal experience myself of having gone through some pretty significant hip impingement. My hip internal range of motion is lackluster, to say the least. And I have had a previous history of back pain and hip pain because of such, or in light of such, and now is feeling much better. So irritability for me came in a multitude of waves, and now the more fitness athletes I've been working with have seen this of they'll have it with double leg work, specifically squatting tends to be the main culprit. They can be all the way from having slight pinchiness and just kind of irritating, all the way to the other end of the spectrum, even in single leg work or such as a single leg pivot and rotate like you're kicking a soccer ball, that compression can be very, very irritating as well to those of individuals that struggle with kind of that pinchiness hip feeling. I've been all the way across the spectrum. If I gotten to the point of where I was so irritable and so sensitive that even kicking a soccer ball more than a couple times would cause a flare up in my hip and I'd be out of commission for a little while. So you need to assess the irritability of these individuals before you jump into the exercises. All right, that is an absolute must to determine what they know or how they're going to feel. In addition, when you're looking at irritability, it's not just in the moment, especially for those who are really having that hip pinchiness. I find that it tends to be much more the delayed reaction. So that 24 hours to 48 hours later, how is the sensitivity of that hip feeling? What is the joint achiness like? What is that like? That's going to be a far larger determinant than that person having exercise in the moment. If they're squatting or performing something into hip flexion that causes that pinch every single time, we need to adjust the exercise or technique to not have that happen in real time. But for most who've had it for a long time, some more persistent pain, you're going to see that their reaction, their body's reaction after bouts of volume of exercise is going to be more important. So let's dive into the spectrum of exercises that we're looking at that I think are the best go-tos for FAI. So number one is if we want to get people loaded, we need to consider that single leg exercise can be fantastic modifications for those individuals working through pinchiness type feeling. My favorite go-tos by far are going to be this Bulgarian split squat, right? Of having their foot up in the back and allowing them to sit back into that hip to one, mediate the amount of torso angle they have and hip flexion. So when I refer to torso angle or hip flexion, this is going to carry over to all these exercises, right? You can imagine in a squat, the more upright I can be, the less hip flexion I'm going to go through, the less demand I'm going to have on that hip joint in terms of compressive forces. So any type of exercise, squat variant that can allow us to keep more upright is going to be a little more beneficial for those people, right? So the Bulgarian split squats and single leg work is my first go-to for a lot of these people. One, because they'll report, okay, I don't have that pinchiness because I get a little bit more movement and room for air in my hips. And two, they're like, wow, I finally feel my glutes, my quads, like the muscles around my leg are working. It's not just this kind of deep hip type feeling. So one, getting buy-in from that's huge and showing that they can still squat in a slightly modified version. So single leg exercises are my go-to if they're not irritable, if they're not that irritable for that, right? If they're feeling good and we can get into some double leg work then, my go-tos for that are going to be either a goblet squat with heel lifts, right? So putting plates under their heels with a goblet squat does two things. One, the heel raise allows us to keep more of an upright torso. And two, that goblet position allows our center of mass to allow us to keep more upright as well. So we can still get through that range of motion with those two variables, allowing us to keep a more upright torso. And then we can slowly wean those off with either the heel lifts or not. Now, the heel lifts can be used regardless of their ankle mobility, right? We always think it's just for an ankle that's not very mobile, but in reality, it's that shift for that nervous system and that more upright torso and center of mass that I think does wonders for these people and allows them to work in and out of that as we go through. So between the goblet squat, the heel lifts, and my second one of being a landmine squat, right? So let me grab over here. If this was a barbell, I'd be holding it like a landmine, so one end is in the ground and the other end stays kind of near my chest. And this acts as a counterweight that allows me to keep more upright torso with my ability to squat down with this. It can be loaded pretty significantly and gives them some sort of center of mass change that allows them to keep a slightly more upright torso. In addition, I find it allows them to sit into their hips a little more, which for some can be a little bit irritable. But for others, they're like, oh, I'm finally kind of feeling the back of that hip and my butt a little bit more. So those are the two more double leg exercises I like to get to. If they're doing well after that and they're still improving, then what I like to go for then is the spectrum of the loaded squats with the barbell, right? So your goblet squat's going to be your number one go-to for these individuals. We're still trying to get load on them. After that, your front squat is going to be the next go-to because, again, center of mass and upright torso is going to be a little bit easier with the front squat, whereas the final end of that is the back squat. So if you're looking at how do I approach the graded exposure of this person to the load that their hips taking on in terms of irritability and sensitivity, that's a really good spectrum for you to look at of goblet squat to front squat to back squats, right? In terms of high bar, and then low bar will get you a little bit more hip flexion. So that's the spectrum. There's a really good graphic from Zach Long that I need to find that I think he might have even seen from somewhere else that addresses that spectrum and shows you all the different torso and hip angle positions. I think it's a great way to visualize that as you go through. So we have our single leg work and exercise that can allow people to feel like it feels good for them. They're getting some work in. We have the modification for the goblet squat exercise, and then we have the modifications of where along that spectrum can I keep them loaded that addresses that torso and hip position, right? All that in mind of the context of what does this person look like in terms of their irritability, that will determine where they start along that line. Now, these all sound great, and it's a lot of finagling and it's a lot of communication between you and the fitness athlete, right? That level of irritability is huge. For those with really cranky hips, that needs to be addressed significantly. That feedback, that 48 hours later, needs to be addressed consistently back and forth of how you feel, what's the volume like. This level of grade exposure is necessary. For me, it took almost 2 years of grade exposure to now be able to back squat with significant weight and not feel it, right? It took me a long time to get there. Again, I did a lot of things up front that didn't help my cause at all, But some people are going to be like that, where they need to be really calmed down significantly and then built back up slowly. And it'll give that joint time, that sensitivity time to decrease, and that joint to feel more comfortable in those positions. I will say, in terms of tempo and isometric squats for these people, I usually recommend a lot of people doing those type of tempo and isometrics when there's tendon pathology, muscle stuff, any other type of pain that's usually mechanical. For pinchy hips, I would stay away from that until very, very late stage when they're coming back. This amount of compression in the bottom of a squat, right, of here, and then holding it in either a goblet or whatever it happens to be, is going to be potentially very, very sensitizing and very, very irritable very quickly. That's just from anecdotal experience of what I found. Now, whether that's more joint compressive forces under more tension, under more time, or whatever that happens to be, that can be an extremely irritating thing. So heavy, slow resistance exercise, perfect, works really well for lots of tendon and more muscular pathology, but for something related to more of maybe perhaps a FAI, pinchy type of feeling in the hips, that's what we're looking at, right? So those are kind of the top exercises in terms of a loaded spectrum, from the single leg Bulgarian split squat, right, to a modified goblet squat with the heel lifts underneath the plates. And then you're working from the front squat to the high bar back squat to low bar back squat if you're looking to load these individuals appropriately as far as they go. Warwick Agreement is absolutely an essential read to look at the general consensus on how we're diagnosing the pathology of FAI and the significance, understanding that those who had a previous history of significant sporting events are possibly more problematic in terms of getting into these new positions because their body's taken on a different type of load before as far as they go, and then addressing irritability along the spectrum of what it is. The last part, and I'd be hard-pressed if I didn't say this, was truly defining if that hip impingement is due to actual joint-iness, right? Or perhaps it's more a hip flexor muscular nature. So Sarah Haran has some great links that I'll post up underneath in terms of looking at, is this truly a joint-related hip pinchiness impingement-like feeling? Or is it possibly that we are just lacking the ability to breathe and brace and have this sequence that allows our hip flexors and other hip musculature to work appropriately with proximal stability? I think she's got some great resources in there, and now is definitely part of the ICE team, and I'll put those down below as well. Last, for some optimism here, so for Movement optimists that I always like to leave you with, I have less than 10 degrees of hip IR in flexion on my left side. Maybe a touch more on my right side at 90 degrees of where I need to get for parallel. And I squat pain-free, right? I've played around a lot in my squat stance with my technique, what's felt good, but most importantly, when I did have issues, I calmed stuff down and I built myself back up gradually. It was painfully frustrating, but once I got it through my head that I was trying to lift to feel good and then slowly build up to hit those intensities, I realized I was able to do better overall in the long run, and now I'm able to squat relatively pain-free with small flare-ups here and there when I really push that intensity. So giving those people some hope and some optimism that, hey, you know, there's lots of people with this type of mobility restrictions that you can continue to work on with all your great PT mobility tools and manual therapy, but if we can slowly desensitize this, build you back up appropriately, we're going to see big things. Unfortunately, it just might be a little more time-consuming and frustrating than you'd like it to be, but if you want to squat, which everybody does, especially in the CrossFit realm, we need to address this up front. So leave them with that kind of movement optimist hope of what you're looking for. Make sure you know you're looking at some sort of jointy FAI hip impingement type thing. Make sure you have the population that might be susceptible to this stuff, and then build on that spectrum of loading all the way from single leg work to modified goblet squats to front squats to high bar back squats to low bar back squats. And you'll find you'll be able to load some people, keep them moving, not have them completely stop, and they'll be great. All right, thanks guys. Hope you have a great rest of the Friday, a great rest of your weekend. I know we got some awesome courses coming up here relatively shortly. I believe Mitch has got a Fitness Athlete live course in Michigan here within the next week or two. And then a whole bunch of other online courses are resetting in terms of the Fitness Athlete Advanced Concepts, as well as Clinical Management, the Fitness Athlete Foundations next month as far as we're going from there. So hope you guys enjoyed. Shoot any questions you have about the hip below. I'll post all those articles I was referencing down below as far as that goes. And then I'll come back with a part 2 on some kind of how do we calm these hips down in terms of recovery or positional things that they need to feel that might be helpful for getting those cranky hips to calm down before we build them back up. So, all right, thanks guys.